But nice to see everyone here. Been having a good time at this conference. I'm here to talk to you about virtualization for developers. And this isn't a very PHP specific talk, I guess, but it is actually very, very relevant for doing web apps. As part of my work with my consultancy, I deal with lots of different clients. I have lots of different projects. And I think everyone in this room knows that with these projects, everyone's got their own framework, everyone's got their own configuration, their own stack, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And whether you're working for just a company, you probably have not a completely static environment. Different platforms have different requirements. Or if you're a consultant like me and you have various different clients and every one of them's got different needs, virtualization is going to help you. So what we're talking about here today is how to combine basically three tools together to create really seamless, really reproducible development environments that can be easily translated into staging environments or production environments. So we're going to walk through all this stuff, and we're going to kind of do it two ways. I'm going to talk a little bit about the tools and how they fit together, but it's actually going to be fairly code intensive. I'll open up, I've got a little sample application that's on GitHub, and you'll be able to just kind of download that and play with it yourself. But I'll walk through the different configurations and what they mean. So by the time you walk out of this talk, you should have a pretty good idea of how you can take this stuff, especially with the sample, and be able to apply this almost immediately to an existing application. So in my, often one of the first things I do when I walk into a new client is I do at least some of this. And it's part of their onboarding process, and it's very useful because it allows me to have just an environment just for them. And then it's also going to be useful for them later as well, because when they bring somebody else on, you don't have to have, actually, let's see a show of hands here. How many people work at a company where you hire a new developer and the developer's got to spend like 2 or 3 days setting up a development environment? Okay, a lot of people, right? And you've got this big document and it's on a wiki somewhere and maybe it's accurate, probably not. And then somebody else gets bugged, because suddenly you need the curl extension and that's just nobody updated the documentation. So you go through all these cycles. What I'm going to show you is going to be a great way of taking all that stuff and putting it in a very natural habitat, which is in your repository. So instead of just introducing a requirement and having that be completely untracked, you actually track this stuff by doing a little bit of work, maintaining some Puppet scripts or a Vagrant file, and then that gets committed. Your DevOps guys will be able to look at that stuff and immediately use it, et cetera. So what are these three tools? Well, we've got Vagrant. Vagrant is a really cool technology. It's kind of a glue. It takes two different things, or actually a bunch of kind of different things. It takes a development environment, like a VirtualBox or Amazon EC2 or anything else, and it glues it together with provisioning stuff. Like, for example, for VirtualBoxes, it's going to manage all your network connectivity and all that other stuff. And it allows you to just basically run one command and go from having no development environment to a fully functional development environment. Then you have VirtualBox itself, which is an open source. I think it's open source at least. It's at least free from Oracle, which is very similar. It's kind of the free version of VMware. Vagrant also, I believe, supports VMware, but I use VirtualBox for my stuff. And then I use Puppet. Now, some people prefer to use Chef. I like Puppet, so I use Puppet. But either way, and then that actually takes the box once it's booted up and actually sets up the server and the configurations and the files and this and that. So this is kind of how Vagrant ties together with the whole thing, like I said. And like I said, so why use VMs in the first place? I work with developers, and it's amazing what the pushback I get from people when I first introduce this technology. I say, well, no, you should do it this way. And they're like, oh, no, I don't like that. They take up too much memory. And, VirtualBoxes take up too much memory and they're kludgy and they don't work right. And, I'd rather run all this code on my host environment, run it natively on Mac OS X. There's a lot of bad reasons to do that. First off, your environment is subject to change. It's a machine that you're using constantly to do all sorts of stuff, and you may tweak a PHP INI setting because you're doing something for Joe, and it ends up introducing a bug or changing the behavior of your primary job, and next thing you know, you're introducing bugs or something's not working right, and it's impossible to track down why. So that's the first reason. The second reason is what I'm going to show you is going to be something that allows you to easily recover from catastrophic failure. I've been, 10 years ago when we would do this, we didn't have technologies like this, and we would have no choice but to set up things on our host environment. Or maybe if we were lucky, we could have our own dedicated Linux box, right? And we could set up, that could be our development box, and then we had a box, to do other stuff. But if that Linux box, if something happened to that, maybe you were upgrading a package and your libraries got screwed up on the server or something, and now nothing's working right. And that could be a week of development time wasted just trying to fix your development environment. With VirtualBoxes, this doesn't exist. If your VirtualBox breaks, you just blow it up and you just recreate it. And it takes basically no time at all in comparison. If you're a contractor like me, it's really nice because you can keep separate projects separate. Even if they're almost identical, it's still really nice to be able to say, well, no, I'm going to have a totally separate environment for this client and that client and this client. And that way I can change at will without worrying or thinking about it. Oh, he wants this extension, or he wants that Apache, or he wants to do this, or he wants to do that, whatever. I don't care. Go ahead. We can just do whatever we want. And so there's a lot of valuable things there. And like I said, getting in the habit of using something like this does a lot of good for the entire release process. If you're using a tool like Puppet or Chef to provision your boxes, how many people are familiar with Puppet at all? Okay, a good number. We're going to go through Puppet in some pretty good detail as I explain this sort of stuff. But using this stuff is really, really nice because it allows you to, in a way that is functional, basically document your server. So you say, well, this is my distribution, or this is my AMI, or this is my base box, and here's the version of PHP, and here's this package and that package, and nothing gets on that box that isn't in Puppet. And moreover, everything in Puppet is exactly what you need to run that box. So if you want to take that and you want to apply that to a production server, you've got a really good foundation for tracking those changes and doing those things. So to get started, you need a couple tools. These are all free downloads. Basically, you need two things. You need Vagrant and VirtualBox, and those are the URLs for them. They come in pretty much every flavor on the planet. So while I'm doing everything here in Windows or in Mac, if you have a Windows machine or if you've got a different environment, these technologies pretty much directly translate. And there's basically 4 steps, well, 3 for us, because we're skipping downloading the tools. But and this is just like, for example, unit testing. There's a little upfront work. The good thing about this stuff is you can kind of create a skeleton project out of it. If you kind of do the same thing over and over again, like with me and my clients, everyone's got a lambda stack, and everyone's PHP 5.3 with maybe a MySQL server and this and that and this or whatever. And so I just have kind of these standard things. And I just take them and maybe I tweak them a little bit and then I'm done. But you want to define your virtual machine, you want to define your Puppet manifests, and then you just want to use them in Prosper. So defining your virtual machine. So everything, when it comes to the virtual machine itself, be that in EC2 as an instance or locally as a virtual box, it all starts with a file called the Vagrant file, which is just in the root directory of your project. So you could take your code base right now and you could create a Vagrant file for it and just stick it in the root of your directory, just like you have your composer.json or whatever, and get started. So the Vagrant file, I believe, is syntactically Ruby-based, although if you don't know anything about Ruby, It's not going to scare you. It's a pretty straightforward configuration document. And it defines a bunch of key things that bootstrap your virtual machine and are necessary. So like, is it an EC2 instance or is it a VirtualBox? The network configuration, if it's a local thing and you want to set up like a static IP to be able to hit your VirtualBox from a browser on your host machine, you can set that up. The provisioning once that box is actually booted. And that's something like Puppet or Chef, where it says, okay, well, here's my provisioning stuff that needs to run once this VirtualBox is created. You can set up virtual machine resource limits. You know, I only want it to be half a gig of memory or this or that or whatever configuration parameters you want to pass along when you create that virtual machine. And all that's defined in the Vagrant file. And they can also be defined for different environments. So you can have one Vagrant file that says, here is what I expect for development. Here's what I want for staging, and you can have different provisioners, right? You can say, so for development, I have VirtualBox with my Puppet manifests, and then in staging, it's an EC2 instance with the same Puppet manifests. And just by changing your environment and running the command, you can bring one up or down or switch them back and forth. And in theory, you're gonna be dealing with pretty much an exactly consistent environment in both cases. So, and we'll get into that in actually, you know what? We'll do that right now before I get into Puppet. So I've got my code base here. So I've got my, let me close all this stuff out. So I've got my Vert for Devs project here, which is just a Zen Framework 2 project. It actually works. It's a little Twilo app where I've got like a Twilo number and I can send text to it. And Twilo calls my app, and it's like a Twitter. It's like a cheap knockoff of Twitter. But I've got and the reason I chose to do something like this is because if you've done anything with Twilo, you realize that building an app that uses Twilo primarily, it's not something that you can do a lot of development locally on, because there's no way to get Twilo's callbacks to hit like a local URL on your machine. Right, you actually have to have an endpoint somewhere out in the public web for Twilo to hit so that you can get your text notification and send your response and do all that sort of stuff, right? So this is actually a great use case. Even if you've got an entirely different deployment process for your code once it leaves development. In this case, I can use it because I need an AWS development environment sometimes. So sometimes I want to destroy my local environment, and I want to take all this stuff and I want to push it to AWS, and I want to do development there for a bit. So getting started here, let's see if I can, there we go. So getting started here, the first part of this is just kind of some basic configuration stuff. I'm setting up 2 things. I'm just setting up a default environment to development if none exists. And I'm setting up role, which is just it's actually not used in the development when it's a local machine at all. But role might be, for example, the security group when you create an AWS instance that's used. And so I turn on SSH forwarding for everything. And then I'll have my, I'll start here with my development one. So if environment equals development. And then I just go through and I set up a few things. I set up the host name of the virtual machine, the VM box. So the way VirtualBox works, if you're not really familiar with it, or Vagrant and this works, is that there are kind of some pre-created, very generic operating system boxes. So this Precise 64 is an Ubuntu environment, 64-bit. There's a whole list of them on I think it's on the Vagrant website, of different options you can choose. There's a CentOS one or whatever. But it's just basically that like kind of core machine. And then the Vagrant up, it points to the URL where I can find that particular box file. And what's going to happen when I do a Vagrant up is if I don't have that box file already locally downloaded, it's going to go to the web and download it first. And then once I have it locally on my machine, it just reuses it anytime I bring the box up. Next, I set up some configuration for my network. So I want to set up a few different port forwards. And this is, like I said, a pretty generic way that I go about doing it. So I set up forwarding port 80, 3306 for my SQL. And since I use Zen Server a lot in my development processes, I forward a few things that are used specifically for Zen Server and in MongoDB and stuff, so that I can get at this stuff from my local machine. Now the intention here is I have this line right below here as well, where I set up this private network, and I give this VirtualBox a static IP. In my experience working with virtual machines, this is actually the third iteration of this kind of process that I've done over the years. When I used VMware, I used to try to do stuff like this before I found Vagrant. And I had a heck of a time with just trying to automate the process of the virtual machine gets an IP address and then having the host machine automatically know what that IP address is without any sort of intervention or some sort of consistency at least to it. It was actually really tricky to get that to work right. And my designers, who were not technical, the whole goal is I should be able to tell my designer, just hit start and it should just work, right? Never worked. He's like, I can't connect to it, and it'd always be some network issue. Vagrant's actually really good about this. So when I give it this IP address, that's the IP address. So what I often do is I'll just go into my Etsy host file, and I can show you, but I'll define a domain name like virts4devs.example.com, and I'll point it to that local IP address. So now when I go into a browser, I can have my dev.whatever.com, and that's my local machine, and that's running through the virtual machine and everything else. So I set all that up, and then I create my provisioning mechanism, which is, of course, in this case, Puppet. And I pass some Puppet options. I want it to verbose and debug. I give it a path to where it can find the Puppet files that it needs relative to the Vagrant file. And then what is my kind of a kickoff? If I want to set up some specific facts, if you're not familiar with Puppet, factor is kind of like the dictionary for Puppet. So it's a way of passing in configurations, things like that, like what is the operating system? Or, is in this case, like, is Vagrant true? Is this Puppet script being run as course of a Vagrant provision? Or what is the environment, et cetera, et cetera. And then in Puppet, I can respond conditionally to various different facts or do things with those various different facts as necessary. And then I actually defined the provider of my virtual environment, which in this case is VirtualBox. I don't want to have, it's headless, right? So I say, I don't need the GUI, I don't need to fire up a visual representation of this at all. I want to customize it a little bit, set the memory of it to 512 megs, create some symbolic link creation stuff. This is all kind of cut and paste. One of the things that is good though is this synced folder. So when this box is provisioned and when this box comes online, /vagrant on the virtual machine, wherever that is going to be your local development environment. So in VirtualBox, if you're running locally, you make any change just natively within your code editor to your repository code sitting on your local hard drive, and that's automatically going to be synced and shared with your VirtualBox. And the same thing is, it's not quite as clean, but it's for like EC2 or something like that, basically the same concept. Like there's the Vagrant directory. So you kind of base everything off of Vagrant, and if you wanted to change that, like if you wanted to have it point to, opt data www or something, you could, but I leave it as Vagrant, and I set some permissions. So, and then I also have a second development environment. In this case, I have the AWS Dev one, and this is a development environment, except I fire up an instance in EC2 to do the development. And in this case, we don't really have a box because we have an AMI, so we just set the box to dummy. This is actually a very important first line. So you can set up different provisioners, multiple provisioners per box, where in the local environment, the precise 64 box that Vagrant Up comes with, it comes pre-installed with Puppet already in the machine. Now, if you go and just get the normal, Ubuntu 12.04 AMI from Amazon and you fire that up, it doesn't have Puppet installed. So what you do is you write a bootstrap script, and I'll show you that, and that's just in the local directory here. So I wrote a little bootstrap script, and this is the first thing that gets executed. So basically the job of this script, it's just a shell script, and it gets run as root, and its job is just to install Puppet. So it just goes through and it does, a wget to pull down the Puppet lab stuff and, just do an aptitude install on it. And that way Puppet's running, or at least not running, but at least available. So when it gets to the provisioning, it doesn't choke out and say, oh, there's no Puppet, I don't know what to do. Please don't steal my access key. Actually, it doesn't matter, I'll delete it after this talk anyway. So then I set my provider for AWS, give it my access key, my secret key, instance type. I mean, this is all, if you've done anything with EC2, these are very standard parameters. The AMI, my key pair name, all the basic configuration stuff. And I actually also provide, like in this case, since it's an Ubuntu machine, I have to actually provide what the actual SSH username is, which is Ubuntu or not root or anything. And I give it my key file. And that actually is one of the interesting things about this. One of the nice little things. Once you bring up a virtual machine using Vagrant, you can just type Vagrant SSH, and it just logs you into the machine. It doesn't matter if it's in EC2 or if it's in development, wherever, like Vagrant SSH will get you in the box. So that's why you have to add the key path and everything. And then I have the exact same Puppet provisioning stuff that I had in my development, pointing to the same stuff. Is there any questions about any of this? No? Sure. Oh, we're going to get into all that. Yeah. This is just bringing the box up. This is not dealing with Apache. This is not dealing with any of that stuff. This is just making the basic wiring. Can I get into the machine, bringing the instance up, bringing it down, doing whatever you want to do. No. And we're gonna get into that. So, which is actually next thing I'm talking about. So once Vagrant has done its job, right? So it's done its job and it's brought the machine online. You now have a shell prompt you can get to, whatever. Before you even really shell to the box, it's gonna go on to this provisioning step, which is when it goes and it fires off Puppet. Now Puppet is gonna be what actually takes care of everything you're talking about. So Puppet's job in the technology world is to make sure that a given server or given machine is in a predictable state. It has this version of Apache running. This file, this configuration file matches the MD5 of the configuration file that it should. Whatever, these packages are installed, blah, 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 all these different things. And there's all sorts of Puppet, they're called Puppet modules that allow you to manage everything from FreeRadius to Zen server to making sure Git's installed or Composer or everything else. And they're all pre-written, so you can just go download them and use them, or you can write your own if you want. I have my own kind of style of doing that I'll show you. And what I do is, once that machine comes up, Vagrant will automatically trigger off that process. So it'll start building the box, it'll start doing, setting up, downloading packages, installing packages, setting up configurations, doing all that sort of stuff based on what you have in your Puppet manifests, which are in your repository. So I'm gonna get into that actually here. So let's talk a little bit about the Puppet stuff so you can kind of get into it. So over here I have my Puppet directory. And in Puppet here, this is not a Puppet talk per se, but it is important to go through. In Puppet over here, we have two basic directories. We have our manifest directory and then we have our modules directory. Like I said, I'm not going to get into all the different ways Puppet works, but basically the entry point to this is site.pp, all right? And I set up a few different things for Puppet. So if you're not familiar with Puppet at all, Puppet is defined by basically a giant dependency tree. It is not a programming language. It is not even necessarily linear. If you include A, then include B, then include C, there's no guarantee that A, B, and C are going to run in succession unless you explicitly define a dependency of A is to B, and B is to C, and C is to D. So, and you'll see where I do that, but otherwise it assumes that this is kind of an independent thing. It doesn't really matter. From a matter of syntax, things with a capital letter mean something different than things with a lowercase letter. So things like exec here, the exec task means execute a command. And so you'll see later where I have a lowercase exec and I'm executing some command to do some sort of thing. The capital version is kind of like a generic, like they're almost like static properties. You know, where a lowercase exec is an instance of exec that's doing something. The default values you can set by using a capital exec. And when you reference a dependency, you always use a capital letter, things like that. So in this case, I'm just setting a log output equals true, which means I'll see the output of the, pardon me, talking with my hands. So where a log output, just I'll see the output of the command, and then I set the path to like some sane configuration stuff. And then I'll set like a variable up here, and I'll say, the site domain, depending on my environment, I can change that in case that's relevant. I need to reference that somewhere else. And then I go through and I just import like node/star.pp. And that's actually where we kind of get started here. So a node, like I said, I'm not going to get too deep into Puppet stuff, but nodes are actually very specific things. They can be attached to fully qualified domain names or host names or whatever automatically. In this case, when you're using Vagrant, you tend to just kind of use the default node. There's really no need to do that because Vagrant's kind of already taking care of some of this stuff for you. And this is where like all the stuff actually really gets fired off. So off the bat, I include a few different modules that I just kind of want universally available. I want my aptitude module universally available. I want my Git module universally available, my Vim. Standard lib is a Puppet standard library that offers all sorts of interesting stuff. And then I have those 3 Vert for Devs ones. And so those 3 are, this is the way I do it. There's lots of ways you could do it, but I kind of break it off into 3 different distinct kind of setups: database, web server, code base. And we'll go into those, and you'll see where I set up Apache and why I have them set up that way. I changed some system values, just based on my experience. It's always good. Changing the file maximum to a really big number is nice. For a virtual machine, overcommitting memory is a good thing. And then I just do an apt-get clean off the bat, just to make sure that I'm in a consistent state, and everything makes sense. And then I do an update as well, just to make sure that all my aptitude repositories are where they should be. And then I do this thing too. So this is almost kind of redundant. I could probably get rid of the apt update exec and just have this one on the bottom, because this little line down here basically just says, anytime I do anything with the package task, I want to execute this apt update. So before I install any packages or anything, let's make sure that my repository is in the state it should be. And so we'll just get into the modules here. So I'm going to skip the apt one because that's kind of one that I downloaded off the web. It's not particularly interesting. I think the Git one I wrote because it's super simple. So this is my Git module, right? And it really, like in my case, it was really this simple. I just wanted to make sure that my package was there. Obviously, you can do a lot more if you want to do something fancy with it. But I just have this class Git, and I just say package Git, ensure present. So Puppet will make sure that Git's installed. And the same thing's going to be for Vim. That's a simple one. But if we get into the Vert for Devs module, this is kind of the most interesting one. So we'll start off with database, because the database is, in my experience, like for this demo, I just include database, even if I'm doing EC2 or something. But this would be one of those things that you might conditionally include based on, is it a local environment or not? Maybe you'll have, you could actually set up Vagrant to fire up 2 different virtual machines. One is a database server, and one is your web server, and you could actually have that environment and that configuration set up if you want. For the most part, when I'm doing local dev, I don't have that problem. I just kind of throw it all together in one virtual machine, call it good. So class MySQL, I'm just creating so class MySQL, I'm using the MySQL module that I downloaded off the web. That's automatically going to make sure that MySQL is installed, automatically going to make sure the client's there. It's going to set it all up. It's going to set the root password, in this case, the password. And then I'm going to take 2 files here, and I'm going to just create 2 files in my virtual machine somewhere. In this case, temp/whatever, 2 SQL files. And the content of those SQL files, I'm going to pull from within my Puppet scripts. So you'll see here I have this URL, Puppet modules, Virt for Devs database, create SQL. So in this case, if you go into Virt for Devs and then you go Files and then Database, I have this create SQL file. So it's going to copy this file from my Puppet manifest into my virtual machine in that temp directory. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's kind of a way of just automatically creating a database structure. Because remember, you're starting off with no database at all, right? So you have this SQL file, which basically bootstraps the database, creates all the tables, maybe sets some indexes, does whatever. And so you copy that file to the virtual machine, and then you basically execute that file as like a MySQL import, like you would from a dump or something. I also create a user, so give it a password, I grant it privileges on a given database, and then here I have these two query files, where I'm saying, okay, so here's this query file I want you to execute, and here's another query file I want you to execute. And you'll note that here on line 35, for example, I have this require statement, and this goes back to this dependency tree thing that I mentioned before. If I don't have this requirement statement here, just because query file in the source code comes after that file reference, that's no guarantee that those things are going to happen one after the other. I have to actually explicitly reference that file, and I have to say, make sure you're good with this file first before you go try to execute this query. So make sure this file's copied over. And also make sure that, for example, I've given proper grant permissions, to my user and everything else. And so that will set up all of my database stuff. Next, we'll look at the web server. So the web server, this is where I set up the actual web server itself. In this case, I'm using Zen Server because that's what I use more often than not. So I include the Zen Server class, which is going to just give me some Zen Server tooling. I include the Apache SSL class. And so I do things like I execute the command A to enable module SSL to turn on SSL on the machine. I disable the default virtual host that comes with the stock Apache, the it works page. Since Zen Server itself comes with like a pair and a PECL and PHPIs and all these sorts of things, I just create some symbolic links for this and put a symbolic link in user local bin by just saying, ensure that it's a link. And again, requiring that Zen Server is actually there. In this case, this is actually a legacy copy and paste thing from one of my clients. I had a problem. This is actually a really good example of why Puppet's so cool, is we had a problem where we weren't using curl, but curl was crashing our server. Like the curl extension or whatever was crashing our server. And we were using for HTTP, but there wasn't really a need for it. We could use sockets or something like that. So we wanted to remove curl altogether from an enabled extension. And so rather than just doing that, which is modifying the INI or whatever, we put it in the Puppet manifest. So there was a commit then, and there was a commit, this is why we removed this is why curl is not being set up. And there's actually something very tangible there that you can see. There's code that says we don't want curl. And so we go look and we find the curl INI, which enables the extension, and we make sure we nuke it. And then we go ahead and copy over our own PHP INI, which again is just in the Puppet manifests. And that will make sure that whatever that Puppet manifest's MD5 is, matches that local or matches that host one. So we're always in sync there. We install a pair package. In this case, we install the DB pair package. And then we enable our virtual host for our domain. And this leads us a little bit into templates. So we specify a template there, virtual dev. And if you go over here into templates, it's very similar to like what you would expect from PHP or something like that. Just a bunch of variables, fill it all in. You can configure it all however you'd like. And then we install Composer, do a Composer self-update, and at that point we declare our web server configured. We've got Apache installed, we've got our database installed now, and the last thing we have to do is actually install our code base. So for the most part, there's not going to be much to installing the code base. Depending on how complicated you want to get, you don't have to do too much with it. When it's a development environment, We just basically want to make sure that we run composer install. That's really all. That's the only thing I really care about, because all the code is automatically, like if it's on a VirtualBox and it's locally running in /Vagrant, it's already going to have like your entire code base itself. But that's not going to include your vendor directory, right? Because that's something you have to run composer install for. So the only thing I really do is I make sure I run composer install, and of course I make sure that I self-update it first. And I could even go farther than that and say, not only make sure that it's self-updated, but make sure Zen server is installed. So I could actually enhance this a little bit. And then I set up since this is a ZF2 app, I copy over local configuration stuff from Puppet to locally configure that, or to configure the application with whatever parameters I want for that environment. And so you can see here, this is an example of where the environment that came from Vagrant is being passed through as a factor fact into Puppet, and then I'm using it here to distinguish what directory, which specific local.php file I'm looking for. So if I go into the files, you'll see I have in config, I've got different tags, and these are like I've got a development version of local PHP or a staging version of local PHP, and those are for the different configuration files and different values. Any questions about any of this so far? Yes? No? Cool. So, all right. Does that answer your question about the Puppet and the? Okay. So, basically that's it, right? So if I want to, to do a live demo here, so I can bring up my terminal here, and I can do Vagrant up. Actually, hold on a second. Let me, what is env? Okay, so my environment is development. Can I make this bigger maybe? Can you guys see that, or should I try to make this bigger? All right. Command plus, is that going to work? There we go. It's Shift Command plus. So run Vagrant up, and it's just going to go through, and like I said, you can see here it's importing the precise box. So I've already downloaded it. And when you first do this, it's going to go off and download the box first and stick it somewhere. But it's going to set everything up. It's going to start provisioning it, doing the networking thing, and then it's going to go off and fire Puppet and create all this stuff. And remember, we're starting from zero, right? There's absolutely no virtual machine at all before we ran Vagrant up. So while this is running, I will talk about a few different Vagrant commands that are really useful. So Vagrant up, you just saw, that's going to bring up your virtual environment. Vagrant halt is basically turning off the virtual machine without destroying it, so you won't re-provision it next time. So if everything's fine and you just want to save some memory or free up some memory or something, you can put it on halt and get the machine in suspend and without having to re-provision it. Vagrant destroy is the opposite. You destroy it, it literally nukes everything, and you have to rebuild the machine from scratch. Vagrant provision will do the exact same thing that it's going to do when it first brings it up. It's just going to rerun those Puppet scripts. So like if you're doing development, if you're testing your Puppet scripts, you want to make sure that things are getting configured properly. You can rerun Vagrant provision. And like I said before, Vagrant SSH will always give you a shell into the box. So looking back here, it's now brought up the box, and it's actually going through, and now it's running. This is all Puppet output. So it's going through and running all my Puppet manifests. You can see here where it's, like this line, it's enable Apache 2 SSL, so it's turning on Apache and doing all these sorts of things. Typically in this output, blue, gray, green, these are good things. Pink or red is bad. So so if you're visually looking at it, you can kind of scroll through real quick and keep an eye out for that sort of stuff. And it's just going to, depending on how quick my network connection is, this shouldn't take very long. I gave this talk at ZenCon and the Wi-Fi sucked, and I couldn't get a provision done in the course of an hour. Like I started at the beginning of the talk, and by the end of the talk, it was still trying to download Zen server and do all this other stuff. But I'll show you when it's done there, assuming it works. So that's deploying locally. That's creating a virtual machine on my local box. What if I want to build this thing into AWS? Well, I already showed you in the Vagrant file how you can define a different environment, and if you go look at that example in GitHub, you'll see that here's how I create an AWS VirtualBox. In order for that to work, though, you're going to need to do a plugin. So you install a plugin to Vagrant called Vagrant-AWS, and you just say Vagrant plugin install, and you're pretty much done. And then when you call Vagrant up, you have to actually specify that provider. So you say Vagrant up -- provider equals AWS. And that way it knows to use the AWS provider instead of just the native environment. And there we go. So we are all done. This is my local environment now, so I can Vagrant SSH. And here I'm now in my virtual machine. So I can go into my Vagrant directory. This is all that code, this is all being synced with my host environment if I want to change stuff. If I go into XC Apache 2 sites enabled, you can see that I've got my little Vert for Devs environment there all set up. This is all being managed by Puppet. So if I change this file on my host machine and then rerun Puppet provision, it's going to nuke it and bring it back to the way it should be. And then I can also go, for example, to vertfordevs.example.com. And with any luck at all, it brings up my app because I have a host entry to that IP address. So a couple other cool tricks. I kind of mentioned a little bit when you're dealing with Vagrant. So if you go look at the Vagrant documentation, it gives you an example of how to create, like I said, multiple virtual machines with a Vagrant Vagrant file, which is nice if you want to have, for example, literally want to have a separate virtual machine for your database versus your web server. You actually want to test and make sure that it's making the connection across the boxes, and or whatever the case may be. So you can create that all. So when you say Vagrant up, it doesn't fire up just one virtual machine. It fires up 3 virtual machines, and they're all interconnected, and they're all provisioned to talk to each other, and all that sort of stuff. And like I said, it can do all sorts of different providers. VMware, if you have VMware licenses in your shop, you can do that. Like I said, I use VirtualBox themselves. If you want to deal with configuration, if you get to be kind of a hardcore Vagrant user, Vagrant files they're created at various levels. So, and then they kind of all get merged together based on a hierarchy to define what the ultimate settings are. So, you've got the box itself has got a Vagrant configuration with it, and then the home directory for your user. If you want to have a user-specific Vagrant stuff, you can do that. And then, of course, the project directory is the one that trumps them all. So that's it, I guess.